Up next, from Chicago, an Illinois Democratic presidential town hall meeting. 5 Democratic presidential candidates appeared in the debate, sponsored by WLS-TV.
Good evening. Welcome to the Illinois Democratic Presidential Town Hall Meeting debate. I'm John Drury. This forum is sponsored by WLS-TV and the Roosevelt Center for American Policy Studies. The center is a Chicago-based, nonpartisan public policy group working to involve citizens more directly in the process that selects the president. All of the leading Democratic candidates have joined us to discuss the issues on the minds of Illinois voters as the March 15th primary approaches. The candidates will be questioned by a cross-section of Illinois citizens. The audience, 120 Democrats and independents, was selected through an open application process. The audience met in February to debate and discuss critical issues and prepare for the program. There are just a few basic rules to follow. Those seeking the nomination will have 1 minute to respond to questions. This first half hour will focus on domestic policy issues. Each candidate will give a closing statement at the end of the first half hour. The second half hour will focus on foreign policy. And again, candidates will have the opportunity for a 1-minute concluding statement. Any opportunity for rebuttal is at the discretion of WLS. Now to my colleague, Marianne Childers. Marianne?
Thank you, John. Questions will be asked tonight in the order in which the candidates are seated on our stage, and that order was determined earlier today by a draw. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce the candidates to you. First of all, from Illinois, Senator Paul Simon. Also from Illinois, the Reverend Mr. Jesse Jackson. Governor Michael Dukakis of Massachusetts. From Tennessee, Senator Albert Gore. And from Missouri, Representative Richard Gephardt. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. We have our first question right here. If you'd stand, please.
I am a student from Champaign, Senator Simon, and I'm very concerned about long-term health care. What specific proposals do you have, and more importantly, how do you plan on funding them?
I believe I have the only specific, comprehensive program of any of the candidates on long-term care. And we cannot just take that money out of the budget. We have basically 3 alternatives for funding. One is an increase of 0.5% in Social Security. Number 2 would be taking the cap off of Social Security. Number 3 would be a series of taxes on cigarettes and liquor. Those are the basic 3 options. We're the only major industrial state in the world that doesn't take care of our parents and our grandparents if they need long-term care. We can do better. And it's just a matter of will. It's a matter of having leadership that's willing to face our problems and not let senior citizens and their families be devastated. I'm committed to moving quickly.
Reverend Jackson, this question's for you.
Yes, Reverend Jackson. I'm a student, I'm a writer, in Chicago, and my question is, given the importance of parental bonding, do you favor legislation mandating parental leave?
It is very important that women first be accorded full respect under our Constitution, and that involves support for ERA. In my campaign, I was put a lot of focus, for example, on comparable worth for women, on raising minimum wage, which affect a tremendous number of women, and daycare centers for children. Surely when women are pregnant, the most natural act, indeed a divine act, women ought to be granted parental leave without punishment or penalty. It's the right thing to do.
Oops.
Yes, I'm a student from Northeastern Illinois University, and I would like to know if you would increase funding for higher education, and if so, how?
Governor, that's for you.
Well, I don't think any of us should kid you. The next president of the United States is going to inherit a terrible fiscal mess. And one of the first things he's going to have to do is go to work and begin to bring that deficit down, and I expect to do that as somebody who's balanced 9 budgets in a row, who's gone through debt, deficit, very hard economic times, and has made the tough choices we're going to have to make. However, I think we've got to invest in students and young people. There's no more important investment in this country than that, and I think there are a series of things that we can do, even in the face of that deficit, to make it possible for you and hundreds of thousands of young people like you to continue your education. First, the annual assault on Pell Grants and Loans has got to stop, and it will stop if Mike Dukakis is president. Secondly, I would encourage states to create college opportunity funds. Thirdly, many public colleges and universities, I think, should be encouraged to waive tuition for students who can't afford the full tuition. And finally, I've suggested that we give you an opportunity to pay back your loans through income withholding after you graduate as you begin to earn. I think that would be the fair and sensible way to do that.
Senator Gore, I'd like you to meet this Illinois voter.
Hi, I'm a mail processor from Chicago. Where do you stand on privatizing the Postal Service?
Well, I'm not in favor of privatizing the Postal Service, because if we did that, the most profitable routes for delivering the mail between high-density areas would be taken over by private concerns. But the very high-cost, low-density areas would not get service. That means that would mean that the public service for those hard-to-serve areas would require more and more tax funds, because they would not have the benefit of the low-cost, high-density service. I'm opposed to that idea. You know, the Postal Service was the second function established by our young nation, first being to secure the national defense, and secondly, at the suggestion of Benjamin Franklin 200 and some odd years ago, we established the Postal Service. I support it. It definitely should not be privatized.
A question now for you, Mr. Gephardt.
Mr. Gephardt, I'm a public policy developer for the City of Chicago. How would you eliminate the farmers' dependency on federal credit support?
Well, I've sponsored legislation with Senator Harkin of Iowa that would, I think, be the best way to get farmers more of their price from the marketplace and less from the government. And it would do that by allowing farmers in each commodity area to vote on whether or not they'd like to have greater supply management, so that they could bring the amount of some of these products down that are in great surplus, so that they would get a greater price from the marketplace. Now, the usual complaint about that is that it would increase the price for consumers. We have studies that show that it would only increase it by 7% over a 10-year period. And I think when you consider also how little the farmer gets out of a usual food product, I think you can see that it wouldn't hurt people much. Wheaties have about 2 cents of wheat in them. Corn, about 3 cents of, in cornflakes, about 3 cents of corn. So I think this is a sensible plan to get farmers a greater price. There are other things we need to do to use the surplus, ethanol and so on, but got to use supply management first.
Senator Simon, as you know, here in Illinois, we face the immense problem of paying the costs of electrical plants that will not be needed, excess electrical plants that will not be needed until the next century. Would you support adoption of a federal transmission policy that it will allow the export of excess power to capacity short regions such as the Northeast?
The problem we face in Illinois is not unique. I would love to tell you that Illinois is the only state that has that problem. What we need is fundamental, and this, what you're suggesting, may very well be part of it. But what we need is an energy policy in this nation. We're 1/5 of the world's economy. We have no energy policy in this nation. It's an incredible thing. We need an energy policy on where we get that energy, you know, the electricity that you're talking about. We need it for oil. We need it for a variety of things. Let me just add one other point. I just want to commend everyone involved in the town meeting. One of the pledges I've made as president is that I will hold a press conference once every 2 weeks, and once a month I'm going to hold a town meeting somewhere in the nation where not only reporters but farmers and plumbers and nurses and housewives and teachers can have access to the president, so that that kind of an issue can be brought up.
Child Welfare Specialist from Chicago for DCFS. I'd like to know what programs would you implement on a nationwide basis to provide accessible and affordable daycare to the people that need it the most, since current programs are falling far short of those needs?
First, we must commit ourselves to a universal daycare program. In part, we got to look at the cost, but how much it costs not to do it. It makes better judgment to invest in prenatal care, Head Start, and daycare on the front side of life than jail care and welfare on the back side. We went through an 8-week school strike here in Chicago, September and October, and we just wouldn't pay the teachers another dime, or the governor wouldn't come back from outside the country. These teachers were taking advantage of the people. Well, I took my children to Cook County Jail on Christmas Day, looked at several thousand strong young men, ages 14 to 19, in that jail. I looked at them and counted the cost. 1 year, full high school scholarship, Chicago, $2,100. 1 year, Chicago State University, $5,000. 1 year, Cook County Jail scholarship, $21,000. It makes more sense to invest in our children on the front side of life while they are children, and to invest in what is the negative byproduct, jails, welfare, and despair.
This question is for Governor Dukakis.
Good evening. I'm a public policy developer for the Chicago Urban League. Governor, in 1984, Reverend Jesse Jackson received a larger percentage of the popular vote than delegates awarded, and perhaps the same thing may happen to other candidates this time. What would you propose the Democratic Party do to remedy this problem in order to develop a more equitable and uniform selection process for delegates to better reflect the percentage of popular vote won by each candidate?
First thing I'm going to try to do, I hope with your help, is win the nomination so I can stop a little bit and reflect on it. I think it's a fairer system this time, because there is now in most states proportional division of the delegates based on the popular vote with a lower threshold, and in that sense I think we're going to have a fair allocation of delegates based on the number of votes that we get. It's always a system that can be improved, and if I'm President of the United States, obviously I'm going to review it with the Democratic National Committee and Democrats around the country and do that. May I make just one comment, if I can, on the last question? You know, in my state, we've helped over 45,000 welfare families to move from welfare to work in the past 4.5 years. Most of those welfare families, as I think all of us know, are single mothers with young children. Daycare, along with real training for real jobs, is the single most important thing that's made it possible for those mothers to get the training they need to get good jobs at good wages, and I mean starting at about $13,000 a year, and get off of welfare. Daycare for those youngsters. It's a very important part of what we have to do in this country.
I'm a pediatrician, and I'm also concerned about daycare. I'm also a new father, and I wanted to ask Senator Gore again about child care. And do you have a program that you may implement as president?
Yes, I certainly do. And I went this morning to the Memorial Children's Medical Center to talk with some of the children there, and I met with several pediatricians there. My wife and I have 4 young children of our own, and I've been actively involved in children's issues. I'm the principal sponsor and author of the Infant Formula Act of 1980, for example, and been very deeply involved in children's issues. I think child care is one of the largest unmet needs that we have in America today. There's no question about it. As we move on welfare reform, we should move on child care also. I have proposed a system of incentives, tax incentives, to make it possible for employers to provide child care for their employees. I've called for national standards on the quality of daycare so that working mothers and fathers can have more confidence in the programs in which they place their children, and projects to provide a role in providing assistance for daycare. I think it's very, very important. And we have to see these problems as being interrelated to another, because daycare should lead us also to pay more attention to prenatal health care and to child health care. Early education. Head Start is wildly successful.
Senator Gore, your time is up.
Well, in any event, I agree with you.
Mr. Gephardt, this gentleman is from DeKalb.
And an anthropology professor at Northern Illinois University. Everybody knows that the job of president isn't done exclusively by the president. The cabinet, the president's advisors make a big difference. What are you looking for your Secretary of State and your Secretary of Defense, and where are you going to look to find those people?
Well, I think first you look for good people who have the kind of background and experience that would allow them to do a good job. You also want someone who has good people skills, someone that can work with, lead other people within their agency so that they can inspire the kind of performance from the people in the agency that you need. I think third, you want people in the cabinet who reflect the diversity of the American people. We have a diverse people in this country, and I think all of our people have to look at our leaders and say and believe that they are represented, that there is something there for them as well. Finally, in those two positions in particular, I would want people who would very much want to follow the President's, my positions on important issues in foreign policy and defense, and would not want people, as we've often had in this administration, who go off and run an independent agency as an independent contractor. I would want team players who really want to carry out the policies that we together would set.
I'm an attorney from Park Forest. Senator Simon, it's no secret there's a real problem with illiteracy in this country. As President, what would you do to improve the situation?
I can tell you that I've done more work on the problem than any other member of the House or the Senate. Held the first hearings on the problem, got $5 million appropriated for libraries, because people who are illiterate will not walk into an elementary school or a high school. I've got some college work-study money, some VISTA money, but if everything I have done has reached 1% of the total, that's probably a high figure. We ought to have a massive assault on this problem. It is a major drain on the economy of this country. 23 million adult Americans can read a stop sign, can't fill out an employment form, can't address an envelope, and worst of all, can't help their children with their schoolwork. We ought to be moving on that quickly, aggressively, and I intend to do that.
Hi, I'm from Lansing, Illinois, and I'm with the Communication Workers of America. Reverend Jackson, since the deregulation of the airline industry, serious and disastrous problems have occurred. The need for additional air traffic controllers is widely known. What are you going to do to remedy this problem?
Well, first of all, it was wrong for President Reagan to bust PATCO as he did. It was a signal of his anti-union behavior throughout this whole administration. Deregulated trucking. The result is we have more hazardous conditions and truck drivers making less wages. They've deregulated the airline carriers, they've deregulated trucks, they've deregulated justice. And that's why when you call the Justice Department now, you never get an answer because the administration is busy taking care of his own business. and there is some sense in which deregulation has really meant busting workers and rewarding owners. There must be a commitment for government again to play a role, dust off the books and the antitrust part of the Justice Department, have a National Labor Relations Board, that's a mediation and another strike-breaking board, so there can be some fairness for the American worker, and again shift the incentives from merging corporations and purging workers and submerging our economy to reinvest in America, retrain our workers, again have a greater sense of balance between management and labor.
A question for you, Governor Dukakis.
Yes, I farm in Peoria County. U.S. agriculture is struggling with surpluses, excess grain, excess capacity to produce grain. This is also true of Europe, Canada, Australia. These surpluses have brought low prices, farm failures, bankruptcies. How would you deal with farm surpluses?
I would do two things. First, I'd adopt a policy of supply management and reasonable price supports, which would bring supply and demand into balance in a way that doesn't cost us $26 billion a year. 6.5 times, by the way, what we were spending under the Carter administration. But I'd go beyond that. We are now spending $800 million a year at the United States Department of Agriculture on research, on agricultural research. Only about 3% of that is being spent to develop new commercial uses for agricultural products. About 97% is being spent to get more production out of an acre of land. Now, you're already so productive we can't consume what you're producing. And I would substantially increase the percentage of those funds that are being used for research. Ethanol, now being required, oxygenated gasoline in Denver. Biodegradable plastics. Plastic is a terrible problem in this country. We can make biodegradable plastic out of corn, which you can throw in the compost pile, which will return to organic matter. Road de-icers. On a major highway in my state this year, we're not using road salt. We're using an ethanol derivative that can be made from corn that melts snow and ice without polluting groundwater, without destroying bridges, and without destroying the underside of cars. It's more expensive, but in the long run, it's a lot more environmentally sound, and we can make it from the products that you produce.
Yes. I'm a teacher from Rock Island, Senator Gore. If tax increases or other revenue enhancement programs are required to balance the budget, what programs do you favor?
Well, I haven't proposed any new taxes as part of my economic plan. I have said that if the preferable measures don't suffice, we may eventually have to have new tax revenue. And I've outlined a series of specific measures, which are standby measures in case we have to move to them as a last resort. One of them would be to eliminate the provision in current law that allows the marginal tax rate to go back down from 33% to 28% for incomes above $200,000. Another would be to impose a luxury tax on purchases above $30,000, to impose a tax on income earned in the United States by foreign citizens and corporations, and I've outlined a series of other measures. If I could comment very briefly on the preceding response, I support an ethanol program also, but I wanted to comment on the proposal for supply control or mandatory production controls, which I disagree with all of my opponents on that, because I think it would not only raise the price of food in the supermarkets, but raise the price of our exports and cost us our foreign markets. I think it would be a mistake.
I'm a junior college teacher from Cicero, Illinois. I'd like to know what you would do to improve and develop a better nationwide junior college system if you're elected president.
Well, I think first we have to look at the federal government's traditional role in education and college education. That's been with loans and grants so that students can go to college. And those programs have been severely curtailed. I met a girl the other day whose parents made about $16,000 a year. She had a 3.6 grade point average, and she was dropping out of college in her junior year because of the cutbacks in the loan program. So I think that's where the federal government has to reassert itself in order to give people the opportunity that we said back in 1965 that we were going to give people, that everyone could go to college no matter how much money your parents made. So I think that's the first place. Most of the junior college support comes from state and local regional districts, and I don't see that changing. I don't see the federal government coming in to fund those programs in a different way. I think we've got to deliver our aid through student scholarships, student loans, student grants that we've done in the past.
We'd like to stop our questions here and conclude our first half hour on domestic issues by giving each of the candidates 1 minute for a concluding statement. Let's start with Senator Paul Simon.
Government has to be responsive to the needs of people. I remember when Ronald Reagan made his speech about government being the enemy. A day or two later in my office, Carbondale, Illinois, a man came in I've known a long time, and I said, "How are you, Dallas?" And he says, "You can't believe how good I am." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "You didn't know it, most of my friends didn't, but I was gradually going blind." He said, "But I just had 2 cornea transplants, and I can see again, I can drive again, I can read a newspaper again." Government research made that possible. I want government that is responding to the needs of people. We have to be a government that cares again, that dreams again, that leads again. And when we have that kind of government, we're going to be a richer, finer nation. We're going to build the kind of a future for our children and generations to come that we need.
Reverend Jackson?
Key to our winning and making a difference in the nation is to revive the hope of the people. You may observe in this campaign I have not been doing any negative advertising or attacking anybody on the stage. One, because my competitor is George Bush. There's not anybody on the stage. Point number one. Point number two, that fights between us will only serve to divert attention away from issues that really count. I want to make a headline: Jackson raises minimum wage. Jackson fights for comparable worth for women. Jackson invests in daycare. Jackson begins to build affordable housing again. Jackson begins to revive the hope and renew the faith of the American people. Jackson stands up and fights drug cartels and stop dope from coming into our country. Stop drugs, save jobs, secure our farms, invest in our children. Just as Jackson represents hope, I'm going to keep hope alive in this campaign. I want to win on Tuesday. Thank you very much.
Governor Dukakis.
I'm a full employment Democrat. That's a phrase you don't hear very much these days. Full employment. And my friends, as somebody who has worked hard to improve human services and social services and education in my state, and I hope as president will be able to do that across the country, I can tell you that none of these things are going to be possible if we don't have a president who can lead us into an economic future that provides a good job at good wages for every single American who is ready and willing to work. And I'm not talking about $3.35 an hour. I'm talking about good jobs at good wages. Somebody who can get our fiscal house in order and who can begin working with the Congress and the American people to invest in that economic future, to invest in good skills and good schools, to invest in training for our workers, to invest in technology, to invest in regional development in those parts of the country like downstate Illinois that's hurting and hurting badly, and so many communities here in the industrial Midwest. I am also very, very strongly committed to health care for every American family in this land. Within the next few weeks, I hope I'm going to become the first governor in history to sign a bill which will guarantee basic health insurance to every working family in my state. I don't know of anything more important than that, more important to our future. And if we can do it in my state, beginning in January 1989, I hope we can do it in the United States.
Senator Gore.
Well, thank you. I'm looking forward to the second half of this forum. I can already say in all sincerity that after 29 debates and joint appearances, we have never had better questions or on a more diverse range of subjects. I congratulate those of you who've been involved in this lengthy process. Like Paul Simon, I've had a practice of having town hall meetings in Tennessee. I've had almost 2,000 of them and have pledged to have them as president. It's part of an effort that I want to make as president to bring the Democratic Party back to the neighborhoods and in the rural areas back to the grassroots. My objective is to put the White House back on the side of working men and women. And that's not just a slogan, that's a commitment backed up by 12 years in the United States House and Senate, fighting a long series of battles for working men and women, for lower telephone rates and lower medical bills, and for a clean environment, for a better health care system, and fighting for children. I believe we've got to understand that as we stand by Social Security and strengthen Medicare, we've also got to invest in our children with prenatal
Senator
care,
Gore, your time
better
is up.
education, to build a bright future with hope.
Congressman Gebhardt.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. I think the issue in '88 is whether we as a people can regain control of our economic destiny. We really are losing it. We're losing it in terms of good jobs and good wages in our country. And I think the issue we've got to address is what we're going to do about it. And I think there are a lot of people in the country that really believe we've got to accommodate decline, manage it, tinker with it on the edges, but basically accommodate it. Well, I don't believe that, and I don't think you do either. That's why I fought for a new trade policy that will open foreign markets and give our workers a chance. That's why I fought for a new agriculture policy so that our farmers can get a fair price. And we can go through the other list and the whole list of issues that need to be addressed. Now, the establishment's answer to all this is really to accommodate decline. Cut wages, cut Social Security. Well, I don't accept that, and I don't think you do either. So this election is a fight. It's a fight for the interests of our people. It's a fight for our economic future. I have fought for these issues in my career in Congress. I want to fight for them as president. And I say to you who will vote on Tuesday in Illinois, it's your fight too. Thank you very much.
And that concludes our first half hour on issues affecting the domestic scene. We'll be back in just a minute with our second half hour dealing with foreign policy. Please stay with us.
If you watch the Congress on C-SPAN, you'll want to purchase the all-new Gavel to Gavel. This newly revised edition will help you understand how the U.S. Congress operates. Gavel to Gavel explains the how and why of television cameras covering the Congress. It includes a rundown of the major players, a sort of who's who of each chamber, and explains the rules that govern congressional procedures. Gavel to Gavel takes a reader on a brief tour through the halls of the Capitol, particularly the House and Senate chambers. Its 64 informative pages are packed with pictures and graphs. Along with a glossary of key legislative terms, it is a valuable resource for students or casual viewers of Congress. In fact, Gavel to Gavel is for everyone with an interest in our democratic process and the technology that brings it to the country.
To order, send a check or money order for $1.50 to Gavel, Post Office Box 75298, Washington, D.C. 20013.
Probably the greatest benefit that we derive is the ability to serve our subscribers with the kind of in-depth coverage of what happens in Washington and around the country. I don't think there's any service in the world that provides the kind of service that C-SPAN provides. Committee hearings in depth 4 and 5 and 6 hours at a time, it just isn't available in television in general, except on C-SPAN.
C-SPAN, created and supported by the cable television industry to offer unique public affairs programming to the nation. C-SPAN is America's network.
Next on C-SPAN, we continue our coverage of an Illinois Democratic presidential town hall meeting from Chicago.
Continuing now with the Illinois Democratic Presidential Town Hall meeting, this half hour is devoted to the candidates' positions on foreign policy. Once again, Marianne.
Okay, a question now for Senator Simon.
I'm an educator from Westchester. Senator, for the last 4 months, almost daily, Palestinian children has been killed and maimed by Israeli weapons supplied by the United States government. And I must say there has been a deadly silence by presidential candidates on this issue. What would be your policy as president concerning freedom and self-determination for the Palestinians?
Well, my stand has been a long one and a clear one. We have to give hope to those people. One of the things I bring to this race is, frankly, some knowledge in foreign affairs. I serve on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. I was part of the U.S. delegation to the United Nations. I have visited the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. And the difficulty in the Gaza Strip particularly, which is even more depressing than the West Bank, is that these people belong to no country. They see no hope. What you need is a United States administration that pulls the Israeli leaders, the Jordanian leaders, and Palestinian leaders together and says, let's get this thing worked out. For 7 years, nothing has happened. Now, in the last few weeks, Secretary of State George Shultz has finally been doing something. But about 1.5 years ago, you can see on the record in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, I urged George Shultz then to move. He's the only one, frankly, in this administration with a background and the knowledge to lead. I know the issues. I know the personalities involved in that area of the world. I believe I can provide leadership.
I'm a gas worker from Lockport, Illinois. My question is that it's been said that because of the Aris plan, the choice in Nicaragua now is between funding the war or supporting a peace effort. How do you feel about this, and what choice do you think we ought to take?
Well, we ought to pursue the Arias plan. It was a mistake for President Reagan to mine the harbor of Nicaragua and then to turn his back on the World Court. One of the things that happened by mining the harbors in Nicaragua and turning his back on the World Court, when Ayatollah did the same thing, Ayatollah was wrong. We had no moral authority to challenge him because we had done the same thing ourselves. We are not threatened tonight by 3 million Sandinistas, and if so, it can't be saved by 15,000 Contras from them. We ought to pursue a policy of aggressive negotiations, and where there are remaining inconsistencies, have bilateral negotiation between us and Nicaragua, which we in fact can do. We must have a consistent foreign policy doctrine. 1, strengthen international law. 2, support human rights. 3, support self-determination. 4, economic development. And 5th, be consistent. If we do that, we'll end the war in Central America, and we'll have peace and prosperity with the other 400 million Latin Americans who are our next-door neighbors.
A question for you, Governor.
Okay. President of the Chicago chapter of Trans-Africa. As president, what would be your policy towards South Africa, apartheid, South Africa's insurgence into its bordering nations, and its illegal occupation of Namibia?
In a minute and a half.
Well, apartheid is wrong, it's immoral, it's unacceptable, it's unconscionable. And we're going to have to get a lot tougher on South Africa in concert with the international community. That means tougher economic sanctions. It means using our moral and authority and our leadership to insist, along with other nations around the world, that the white power structure in South Africa begin to move in the direction that they ought to move. Constructive engagement is a failure. I think we all know that, and we've got to be much, much tougher. The second thing we have to do is work much more closely with the frontline Southern African states to help them to build better relations with them, to help them move away from their dependency economically on South Africa. The third thing we have to do is end this absolutely bizarre policy of ours in Angola, where, if you can believe this, we're supporting a so-called rebel organization whose principal patron is South Africa. This rebel organization is attacking American oil companies that are being protected by Cuban troops. Now, if you can figure that out, you're better than I am. It's got to stop. If we do all these things, then I think we can begin to bring some sense of moral justice and opportunity to that part of the world. I wish I could be a little more optimistic about the white power structure in South Africa, but I think the next president of the United States has to lead on this issue.
I'm a social worker from Chicago. The United States is historically a nation of immigrant and refugees, and who have contributed so significantly to the economic and cultural strength of this country. As a member of the community, I'm very concerned in the recent government trend towards much more restrictive policy. What's your position on this issue?
Regarding immigration?
Yes.
Well, I believe we should always have our doors open. It's the American tradition to welcome new immigrants to our shores. But we must have some control over the numbers of immigrants that come in each year. That's why I have supported efforts to reform our immigration laws to have some predictability to the number of immigrants who are coming in. It's not fair to those who abide by the laws and wait for a long time in line to come in legally, for others to completely disregard the law and flood in by the millions. We have to have some control over our borders and shores. Now, the current immigration reform law is not being applied fairly. The Immigration and Naturalization Service did not gear up to handle the changes in the law. It is another example of the Reagan-Bush administration not performing competently when a new law is passed. They knew it was coming. We in the Congress warned them of it, and they simply did not respond.
Yes, I'm a small business owner from Peoria, Illinois. I'd like to ask Mr. Gephardt, what changes would you make in reference to education, attitudes, and work ethics in relation to world markets to make us more competitive?
Well, I think in order for us to be high in performance and productivity, we have to pay a lot greater attention to education. It's why I constantly say that when I'm president, I want to set a goal with the American people that by the year 2000, we will have the best educated people in the world. That kind of a goal is absolutely necessary over the next 20 years in the kind of world we live in today. If we're to hold our standard of living, which is the great challenge, We can only do it if our people are educated enough so that we can make the kind of sophisticated, complicated products that we're going to have to make. And I happen to believe you've got to make things as well as deliver services in order to hold a strong standard of living. And that's why education is so critical. In addition, we've got to lead and inspire employees to be high in performance. I've been in plants all over this country, and the good ones are always ones where the leadership in the plant really believes that their employees are the most important thing in their business. And when that's the attitude, and that can be expressed by the president as well as corporate leaders, then we really will have an excellent country in terms of the kind of products and services we make.
Senator Simon, I'm a lawyer from Rock Island. Regarding the Central American issue, would you support a government which was democratically elected down there, even if their interests tended to diverge at times from what we might view as U.S. national security interests?
We can't expect governments in other countries just to follow what we want all the time. I don't even agree with our own government all the time. Let's tolerate some diversity and let other countries plan their own futures. And they're not all going to be carbon copies of the United States. Let's do what Jimmy Carter did and stress human rights. But then let's also look at our own interests. And instead of being so preoccupied with Nicaragua, and I recognize its importance, but it has 3 million people. Right next to us is Mexico with 85 million people. Infinitely more important. Mexico is headed toward major population growth and huge problems. And unless the United States works with Mexico, we're going to have some very, very real problems just south of the border that we're ignoring. No two nations living next to each other have as great a difference in the standard of living as the United States and Mexico. We better work with Mexico much more.
I'm a housewife from Joliet, Illinois. And under what circumstances, if any, should the United States intervene militarily in Central America?
That's for you, Reverend Jackson.
Well, if our interests were threatened, we would do that, but that is no basis for even thinking that way. The reality is we ought to intervene diplomatically and stop intervening militarily through the Contras and exchanging drugs for arms. That's beneath the dignity of our country. The fact is that President Reagan has not worked hard on a Central American policy. He's expressed real contempt for that government and wants Managua as a trophy case or a notch in his belt. We need to have a vision beyond that corrupt relationship with Nicaragua. I say the future for our country. There are 400 million Latin Americans. We should be exporting grain and tractors and medicine and rail and infrastructure to 400 million Latin Americans, help reduce their debt, reduce our deficit, and have growth, peace, and prosperity for all of us, as opposed to bringing down our nation in disgrace in the illegal, immoral relationship we now have with the Contras operating out of Miami as hired hands for the Reagan administration. It's beneath the dignity of our government.
Governor Dukakis, I'm a college administrator here in the city of Chicago, and I would like to know what would be some of your proposals for securing the freedom of the captives being held in the Middle East.
I mean hostages?
Yes.
This is probably one of the toughest things a president has to face, and yet we must have a tough anti-terrorist policy, which never, ever, ever makes concessions to terrorists and hostage takers. Now that's not easy for a president when you're sitting there with families whose loved ones have been seized and have been taken hostage. But the thing that made the Iran-Contra scandal such a terrible mistake was that we in effect gave a signal to terrorists all over the world that if they took our hostages, we'd pay them back. We'd exchange arms for hostages. You never, ever can do that. You can talk, you can negotiate. But we need a tough anti-terrorist policy in this country which recognizes terrorism for what it is, international crime, pure and simple, with tough police work, with undercover operations, with military strikes against terrorist bases if necessary. But we must never, ever, ever make concessions to terrorists. If we do, the consequences will be obvious. We will encourage more and more people to take hostages and then hold us up. And we can never, ever do that.
I'm a student from Knox College. Regarding Panama, Senator Gore, what specific steps would you take to dismantle this highly explosive but complicated issue?
Well, as with so many problems, the key strategy is one of prevention. It's outrageous that the current administration apparently had evidence available to it quite some time ago that the leader of Panama, Noriega, was involved in drug smuggling, and then they continued to have secret dealings with him, sending him money and counting him as a valued and trusted friend and ally. It's outrageous. I was last asked the other day, isn't the threat from Nicaragua greater than the threat that we're talking about with Panama? The answer is the flow of illegal drugs from Latin America is the most serious threat we have in this hemisphere. We have got to have an all-out war against drugs. And there'll be a message for the drug smugglers in a Gore administration, whether they're in foreign countries or here in the United States. We're going to tell them they're out of business. Now, where Noriega is concerned right now, we should be putting economic pressure on him, and we are to some extent. The military exercises in the Panama Canal Zone are fine. We should slowly ratchet the pressure on Panama in order to increase the odds that he will be thrown out.
This gentleman has a question for you, Representative Gephardt.
Representative Gephardt, I'm a labor union representative from Chicago. There is currently on the ballot that you're running on in the state, March 15, a referendum to keep the Illinois National Guard out of Honduras. Do you support that and keeping the military totally out of South and Central America?
Well, I don't support the government's policy on Nicaragua and have led the fight on the floor of the House to cut off aid to the Contras. But by the same token, I am not for the states making decisions on their National Guard that can overrule what the federal government is trying to do. I, for instance, don't agree with the President's policy on Nicaragua, but I don't think we ought to allow states to override the President's decision in federalizing the Guard or the National Guard units. If we did that, for instance, when President Kennedy sent the National Guard to the South in order to make sure people had civil rights, we would have allowed state and governors to override the decision of the President in that case. So I think that can be a dangerous precedent. But I want to make it very clear that I'm very much against what the President has done in Nicaragua. And if we haven't cut off Contra aid by the time I'm President, the day after I become President, we will.
I'm a lawyer from the small town of Hoopeston. Senator Simon, as you know, we in Illinois have lost tens of thousands of jobs to the trade deficit. If you're elected and if negotiations continue to fail to open our allies' markets to our products, would you take steps to make our markets less accessible to foreign imports?
We clearly have to face the trade problem, and Hoopeston is in Vermilion County. Vermilion County has a sizable amount of unemployment. There are some other counties in the state that have even more unemployment. We have to do everything we can to see that we have private sector jobs, and part of that is moving on the trade issue. The devalued dollar should help, but we need some other steps. And they are not erecting a fence around our country as much as tearing down other fences. We have to say to our friends in Japan, for example, when you build a car over there, you have $26 worth of American auto parts. When we have a Ford, Chevrolet, or Plymouth over here, we have $700 worth of Japanese auto parts. There has to be greater reciprocity here. Second, we need to have one person in charge of trade. We can't have 18 different agencies as we do right now. Third, we need to work out credit for small corporations that want to go into the export field. Very tough for a small corporation to do that. And then finally, we're going to have to learn foreign languages in our schools. It gets back to the area of education. If you want to sell in other countries, you have to speak the languages of your customers.
I'm an attorney from Whiteside County. Reverend Jackson, under the current administration, we have often flaunted international legal principles and refused to submit disagreements to the International Court of Law. If you were president, would you agree to submit disagreements to the International Court of Law on the request of an involved nation?
Well, certainly we ought to strengthen international law. Given our global interests, our interests around the world, we stand the most to gain from international order as opposed to international piracy or terrorism. That's why it was such a big mistake once the World Court made a judgment about Nicaragua for us to simply dishonor them and use the arrogance of our power and run over them. When in reality, though the court was not a binding court on us, it gave a tremendous signal as to what our options were. We turned our back on the World Court, and then when the Ayatollah mined the harbors of Nicaragua in the Persian Gulf, we could not then call upon the court because we had discredited that court. I am against state-sponsored terrorism, for example, anywhere around the world. But let's measure it by one ethical yardstick, not by two political yardsticks. I'm for human rights all around the world, but measure human rights by one yardstick. Latin America, Afghanistan, Middle East, South Africa. Law and ethics will help us measure the game by one set of rules, and that's what the international law would do for us.
I'm a public policy analyst from Chicago. Governor, how would you foster self-sufficiency in food production in third world countries without hurting U.S. interests by closing any potential export markets?
Well, one of the remarkable things that's happened over the past 50 years, 30 years, 10 years is that this wonderful research and technology that we've done in improving yields and improving productivity on our farms has been transferred to other countries, third world countries that just a few years ago were not self-sufficient, couldn't feed their people. And now we have nations like China and India that are not only self-sufficient, but beginning to export. Now, that may, in the short run, perhaps be viewed as being against our national interests, but I think it's an extraordinary thing that this country has given this technology and this research to the world, and nations where famine and starvation were common things just a few years ago today are feeding themselves and their people and even exporting. Now, obviously, that has an impact on our ability to consume or export the products that we're growing, the crops we're growing on our farms, and that's one of the reasons why, in response to this gentleman who was a farmer from Peoria, was it? Just outside of Peoria. I've suggested that one of the most valuable things we can do is to begin to invest in these new commercial uses of agricultural products that can help us to clean up our environment and utilize those products at the same time right here at home or around the world.
I'm a university administrator from Springfield, Illinois. What specific policies would you put in place to prevent the spread of nuclear weapons to other countries?
Well, there is a treaty called the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty today, but we have not been enforcing it very well because some countries have been able to circumvent it and violate the provisions of the treaty. In that treaty, there is a bargain between the superpowers on the one hand and the developing world on the other hand. The superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union particularly, and others, undertook to control the nuclear arms race. And in return, the developing nations agreed to forego the acquisition of nuclear weapons for the first time. Well, we and the Russians have not kept up our end of that bargain. We have seen the arms race accelerate in recent years. Now they're talking about Star Wars. Well, that deprives us of the moral authority that we need in ample measure to prevent other nations from acquiring nuclear weapons. We've got to be tough in enforcing the provisions of the non-proliferation law.
Senator Gore, your time is up.
Okay.
Congressman Gephardt, I'm a writer from Highland Park, Illinois, just north of here. The trade policy that you propose seems to focus more on punishing our trading partners rather than on reducing the consumption of our imports and improving the competitiveness of our exports. Aren't you afraid that your trade policy would lead to a trade war in which everyone loses?
I don't think so, and I think it really does focus on what I think are the unfair practices of other countries. It calls for a good and sufficient period of negotiation so that the president can try to get a change in behavior. It addresses only countries that have a pattern of unfair practices against us, so it doesn't deal with just commodities. It deals with an overall long-term practice. And then it gives the president a power to begin penalizing products coming here if there is no progress in those negotiations. Now, my belief is that unless you put that stick in the closet, you will not get the kind of change in behavior that we need. And I think there's ample evidence to back up my statement. When we finally have done things against countries that have failed to live up to treaties or to other cases we filed in the International Trade Commission, they do open up. Japan on microchips, Canada on wood products. In almost every case when we have finally taken assertive action, they will open up and they will change behavior.
Well, those are all the questions we can accept from our audience tonight. Our time is gone. The candidates now have 1 minute each to sum up their ideas on United States foreign policy. And we start with Senator Simon. Senator?
It is vital that while we maintain our deep commitment to freedom, we move away from the arms race in a sensible and creative way. In response to the question that you asked back there, one of the steps we ought to take is to say to Mr. Gorbachev, and I intend to do this on January 20th of next year with your help, is to say to him, if you're still willing to stop nuclear warhead testing, let's stop it right now. Both sides. It's verifiable. And then let's start using the resources of this great country and of other countries, not for just piling up weapons of destruction endlessly, but for enriching our people. So we get those jobs in Vermilion County, in Peoria County, and elsewhere around this nation. And we can help young people, not only in this nation, but all over the world who don't have an adequate education and all kinds of other things. We can be a richer, finer world if we provide leadership in this great country.
Reverend Jackson.
I have a sense of what our foreign policy options ought to be. Lieutenant Robert Goodman was down in Syria. President Reagan said we couldn't get him home. I went to Syria and brought Goodman back home, and I didn't leave a cake or a Bible with Assad. I understand foreign policy. I brought Americans back home from Cuba and took Castro to church for the first time in 30 years to ease church-state tensions. I'm concerned about deterrence against the Soviets, and we have ample deterrent power. Number one threat to national security this night to us is drug trafficking. $150 billion a year worth of drugs coming this way. We must stop the flow of drugs. They are a dimension of our foreign policy, either the most inept dimension or the most corrupt dimension of our foreign policy. Don't just focus on children and ball players. That amount of money is being laundered by bankers. It's corrupting people in high places. I believe in a strong defense, but it doesn't make sense to me to have borders vulnerable in Texas and Florida and 300,000 troops in Europe. Strong defense
Reverend Jackson, your time is up.
At our own borders. Thank you very much.
Governor Dukakis.
We need a president who, beginning in January of 1989, will help to shape a foreign policy that does 5 fundamental things. First, it must be a foreign policy that reflects American values, that reflects our respect for international law, that reflects human rights and what this country is all about. Secondly, we need a strong national defense, but I mean a strong national defense that is lean and tough, that isn't spending $600 for toilet seats, that doesn't have tank commanders in Europe that can't drive their tanks more than 3/4 of a mile because they don't have enough fuel while we're spending billions on Star Wars. Thirdly, we need a new international trading system that will give us more trade, not less trade, and will benefit all nations, including third world nations as well as ourselves and our basic trading partners. Fourth, we need a tough policy against international terrorism and international drug trafficking, and I mean a tough policy. And finally, we need a president who will take advantage of the best opportunity we've had for meaningful arms control and arms reduction in our lifetime, going beyond the INF Treaty to strategic arms reduction to a test ban treaty and to the beginning of negotiations for reductions in conventional forces in Europe with deeper cuts on the Soviet side. If we do those things, we're going to have a nation that we can be proud of all over the world.
Senator Gore.
In just 5 days, the people of Illinois will go to the polls and have a very significant say in who will be the next president of the United States. If you want an alternative, if you want a president who will serve as an agent of change in this nation, if you want a president who will fight for working men and women, put the White House on the side of average citizens, and bring the Democratic Party back to the neighborhoods and the grassroots, I ask for your support. During 12 years in the House and Senate, I fought a series of battles for working men and women. I have opposed some of the most powerful interests in this country. That's the kind of leadership and commitment that I want to take into the White House. I have 3 goals: economic growth, which means better jobs and a more competitive America; social justice, which means continued progress on civil rights; a cleaner environment, better health care, and a better education system for our children; and a strong, intelligent role for this nation in the rest of the world. That's the kind of leadership I'm offering in this election. I ask for your help because I believe that together we can rekindle the spirit of America and build a future with hope.
Congressman Gebhardt.
I want America to have a new defense and foreign policy in 1988. First, I want it to reflect our values. It is not consistent with our values to send